Thank you again for joining us this evening, The Islanders TV.
Today is Thursday, February 18, 2016, and we're commemorating the 70th anniversary of the Rescission Act by having this community conversation to bring into light some of the things that are still in the gray area about the Rescission Act, and perhaps to answer some of the questions that are bouncing back and forth. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the Veterans War Memorial Building, and specifically the Filipino Veterans Education Center, which houses all the artifacts and all the documents of the Filipino War to veterans since 1945. We've had a long and historical presence here in the building, and I'm hoping that what we're doing here today will further enhance the Philippine Veterans Education Center by having a chronicle of what do we know at this point in time about the Rescission Act, because I'm almost certain that at some point there are more documents that are on the surface that we don't know anything about, that we haven't heard of. So I would like to ask from my left to introduce himself, and let's begin the conversation.
I'm Perry Diaz. I'm a columnist, syndicated columnist, based in Sacramento, California.
I'm Rodel Rhodes. I also write for the Inquirer.net. Emil, I used to teach Philippine history at San Francisco State University, and I've written a number of articles over the last 30 years now about the Rescission Act. So I'd like to just share what I've learned over the last 30 years.
My name is James Sabrito. I'm a professor in ethnic studies, and my area of specialty is Filipino immigration, roughly the 1900s all the way to 1934. My specialty is actually the Taiwanese McDuffie Act and the exclusion of Filipinos.
And my name is Emil Guillermo, and I'm a columnist. I write for the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, also Inquirer.net and NBCnews.com. And I've been writing about the Rescission Act for a long time also, but never with the kind of detail that people are about to discuss today, because I think simply most of the time we've just glossed over the Rescission Act. And I think now people are digging a little further, and some of the things that we're going to learn today are going to be pretty fascinating. So I'm happy to be here.
So to get started, I'm going to ask Rodel to preface and give us an overview of what the Rescission Act and what the agenda about this evening is all about. So please, Rodel.
Thank you, Rudy. You know, Rudy and I have coffee regularly, sometimes on a daily basis. And about 2 weeks or so ago, when we had coffee, I told Rudy, you know, the 70th anniversary of the Rescission Act is coming, and we should really commemorate it because it's a significant event in Philippine history. He thought we don't have enough time to put this thing together, so nothing else was happened until a week ago when we had coffee again, and I said, you know, we can do it. And that night when Rudy went home, he put together the flyer for it and posted it on Facebook. And then it was on, and then I decided to write an article about it for the Inquirer.net, and to use that flyer that he did as the main photograph. And it came out today in the Inquirer.net. And the article is called 70th Anniversary of the Infamous Rescission Act of 1946. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I've written considerably about this issue, but even then, in preparing for this article and this talk, I found new information I didn't know before. And it explained to me why it happened and what the ramifications were. So what I'd like to do is just share what I wrote. We know the bill was passed on February 18, 1946, exactly 70 years ago today. It was supposed to be a simple appropriations measure that was expected for some time because the Commonwealth Army of the Philippines, after the war, needed funds to keep it going. It had been decimated for the 3 years of the Japanese occupation. So the funds were to pay for a number of things. The president of the Philippines at the time, the Commonwealth government, was Sergio Osmeña. Look at the picture below, he was in the landing of Leyte with General Douglas MacArthur and Carlos P. Romulo. And Osmeña was expecting an appropriations of about 1.2 billion to cover all the needs of the Commonwealth Army and everything else after the war. So he was shocked to find that the amount that was only going to be allocated was 200 million. The appropriations measure went through the US Congress in January of 1946. It passed the Congress in January, and it went to President Truman. And President Harry Truman vetoed the bill. Now, all these years I've been writing about it, I never heard about the fact that there was a first Rescission Act and that it had been vetoed by President Truman until I saw, and I found on the internet, a letter written by President Sergio Osmeña addressed to Carlos P. Romulo, who was then the resident commissioner of the Philippines in Washington, D.C. Romulo was also in the landing of Leyte, and after the government was established back in the Philippines, he was appointed by Osmeña to replace Manuel Elizalde, who had been the resident commissioner at that point. I have a few more copies here. I'd like to just share this with you because it, to me, is quite a find to find this letter. But what the letter says is that, here, someone. What the letter says is that, the first Rescission Act was vetoed by President Truman, and President Osmeña was very glad, very elated, and he told the ambassador, Resident Commissioner Romulo, that this was a blessing in disguise. Now, first of all, before getting into his letter, let me give you a background on the bill itself. During the war, as the war was coming to the end of the war, the members of the US Congress, led by Senator Carl Hayden from Arizona and Senator Richard Russell from Georgia, were starting to think about the American soldiers that would be coming back to the war, what resources will there be for them. Congress had passed the GI Bill of Rights in 1944. Anyway, there's reference here that was in 44. Could not be 46 because the bill, anyway, it was in 1944. And so they needed to have funds for the GI Bill of Rights because that would provide education for returning GIs. And so he asked, Senator Hayden wrote a letter to General Omar Bradley. General Bradley was the Secretary of the Veterans Administration, and he asked General Bradley, how much will it cost to pay for the Filipino veterans who are members of the United States Armed Forces? And in response to his letter, General Bradley wrote that, well, they're all members of the U.S. Armed Forces. They're entitled to the same benefits as the American veterans. If we were to take out just the ones that go to the Filipinos, his estimate was that it would be $3 billion. So that figure was the one that was of concern to Senator Hayden and Senator Russell in particular. And the only way that they could save the $3 billion was to pass a bill that rescinded the rights of Filipino veterans to receive the same benefits as the American veterans. Now, that rider, well, that would require them to rescind the executive order that President Roosevelt signed on July 26, 1941, when he signed an order incorporating the Philippine Commonwealth Army into the United States Army forces in the Far East. There were about 100,000 Filipinos who enlisted after the notice was out that if you become part of the U.S. Armed Forces, you will be entitled to the same benefits as American soldiers. There will be no line between Americans and Filipinos in receiving benefits. They would get the same. So, in order to remove the effect, even though Roosevelt died, Truman, his successor, continued with it. Even though it was an executive order, if it is not overruled, it still becomes or remains the law. So in 1946, the order of President Roosevelt in 1941 was still the law. They would receive the same benefit. The only way to overcome it, if Truman didn't change it, was for Congress to pass a law that changed it. And that was the impetus behind the first Rescission Act in 1946. But fortunately, at least at that time, Truman vetoed it, and this letter of President Osmeña thanks Truman. And if you look at this, he writes what were the benefits that Filipino veterans would receive as members of the U.S. Armed Forces. Now,
Okay, wait. Let's stop here because it's 15 minutes and you're the only one talking so far.
I understand, except I thought what would happen is people would then respond and react, because this is new information that we're getting that explains it.
And this is one of the gray area that I'm talking about, because Osmeña died in 1944.
No, that was Quezon who died in 44.
Quezon died, sorry.
Osmeña ran for president against Rojas in 1946, and he lost to Rojas. So the elections were in April of 46. The inauguration of Rojas was on July 4, 1946.
Okay, so the question is that how can Quezon write this?
It's not Quezon, it's Osmeña. You should really read it.
But how can Osmeña write this, talk about this when this is 1946?
He was president in February of 1946.
Quezon?
Who
died in 1944?
Quezon. And who was his vice president? Osmeña.
Okay.
Who became president after he died? Osmeña.
Okay. And
So until
so this is a letter from the vice president.
From the president.
Or when he became
Because
after. Oh, okay. Go ahead.
now
Now I
the
understand.
disease at that time.
I could ask you to read it before.
Well, no, because these are some of the things that need to be clarified.
Yeah, and
Because
if
we just found this thing out. We didn't know anything about
Okay.
the
Anyway,
fact that Truman vetoed the first rescission.
I know, that's why I'm talking about it. If you let me
So,
finish.
Riddell, where did the authenticity of the letter is verified? You got it from a,
Yeah,
I mean,
it's, you can,
because
here, it's,
Romulo, we don't know what Romulo said, right?
well, we don't know what Romeo said, but you can check Commonwealth of the Philippines, www.gov.ph.tag, Commonwealth of the Philippines letters. So it's all on the website.
So it's in the Philippine government's
Yes.
official documents.
It's an official document of the government.
The original document.
It's in the Presidential Museum and Library. Huh?
The original document of this letter.
It's in the Presidential Museum and Library. It's
Signed by Osmeña.
Signed by Osmeña. It was written by Osmeña.
So there was an objection to the first Rescission Act, that was vetoed, but why did the second, why did
Okay,
the...
let me
Okay,
proceed.
right.
Well, that's good. Now, so first of all, in the letter, which is, as I said, I was so impressed by the fact that the letter talked about what were the benefits Filipino veterans were to receive if this Rescission Act had not passed. And well, he was writing it like, well, good that Truman vetoed it, therefore Filipinos would receive the same. And here they are, you know. So if you look at this, it said they would get pension for non-service connected disability. Not just service connected, but also not, you know, they would get insurance against death in line of duty in active service. They would get medical and hospital treatment. They would get vocational rehabilitation.
Under
They
the
would
GI
get-
Bill, under the GI Bill of Rights.
Well, not just the GI Bill of Rights, there were also other things. The GI Bill of Rights was just one of them, but there were other rights at that as U.S. veterans they were entitled to.
So actually, this is an outline of exactly what regular
Correct.
American soldier will
Correct.
receive.
Yeah,
Right.
and if you look, what especially, you know, aside from 6 months death gratuity, pension, the one thing that was impressive to me is that when we look at the stories of Americans who returned from the war, what got the U.S. economy back was that so many of them were able to avail of the GI Bill of Rights, and they went to college, got degrees,
Bought homes.
and many of them were able to get loans, preferential loans, low interest loans, and were able to buy homes. And they were able to get part of what he wrote here is that they were also entitled to certain benefits if they're not able to get a job. It's all here that the Filipino soldiers under the U.S. Army were going to get. So the estimate of General Bradley is $3 billion. Now, $3 billion in 1946 dollars is you can just imagine. But I keep thinking about the fact when I was reading this that how the Philippine economy would have dramatically changed if at least 100,000 Filipinos soldiers. Look at what in this letter here. He talks about the fact that each of the, he said that there were 70,000 members of the Philippine Army who were in the active service of the U.S. who died during the war. Assuming 20 of them applied for insurance at $10,000 each, which was reasonable, that would have amounted by themselves to $200 million. The dependents of the remaining 50,000 with an average insurance of $5,000 each would have been entitled to $250. That's already $450. And then aside from that, it provided for pensions. He went through each one. Each of these benefits, as he outlined it, would have resulted in a total of $1.275 billion just for insurance and pension benefits, not even for the education, the GI Bill. Just the pension benefits alone were $1.275. If they had received that, can you imagine how the trajectory of the Philippine economy and the progress of the Philippines would have been if you had 100,000 Filipino veterans, even the relatives of those who died, receiving benefits, going to college, being able to avail of the GI Bill of Rights? That would have dramatically changed the whole economy, the whole, the future of the country.
Yeah, but Rodel, hold on, stop right there. The $3 billion that Omar Bradley quoted was over the lifetime of all the veterans, meaning that from the time until all the veterans die. So it's not like one lump sum of $3 billion that he was talking about giving to the Philippine government. It's the cost of the veterans from pension, healthcare, etc. So over the lifetime. But let me just interject to what is going on, because in 1998, when the Equity Act was finally heard on the floor of Congress, the United States had $3 trillion surplus. And when the Filipino community went in for Congress, they were asking only for that $3 billion. Okay, the bill failed by 11 votes. And one of the reasons why it failed was because Chairman Stump, who was the chairman of the VA at the time, or the committee at the time, said that there was no promise made to the Filipino veterans. There could not have been any promise made because the GI Bill of Rights did not even kick in until 1950. That's his testimony.
Well, it's
Wait,
wrong. Anyway,
No, but that's his testimony, and that's the thing that we need to clear, to bring up to light. Because Tom Campbell also said that there was no promise made to the veterans other than you join the US military and you can become a US citizen right there on the spot. You don't have to come to the United States. You can become naturalized right there on the spot.
It's really important to focus on the facts as we know it here.
Well,
Let me
wait. These are facts.
No,
Because
but you're already going into Stump and
forward.
you're going forward.
Let's stay
We're
7 years
just
ago.
talking about
Still.
what happened first. Let's keep it there.
For now.
Okay,
And then we'll get
but
to
you
before.
mentioned about
Okay,
Omar
no, go
Bradley $3 billion over the life. Actually, what was good about this is what President Osmeña said is that, okay, taking 15 years as the average life of a pensioner, the total sum of 90 million would be due to the disabled veterans. Summing up, the payment, the amount payable for insurance and pension benefits was 1.275 billion. But here's the thing that was interesting earlier than that. It said, pension for those who lost the use of their hands or legs, with an average disability pension of $50 a month, 10,000 soldiers who were disabled from the war should get 500,000 a month or 6 million a year. Physical disabilities in most cases are permanent, and the disabled veteran continues to receive the disability pension in his lifetime, which is say 15 years, that's 90 million. So we're talking about 90 million for disabled veterans. So the amount of 3 billion is not really that far off. It's not like saying we're talking about 50 years. No, that 3 billion was
You know, Cordell, the details here are interesting, but the key line for me is on page 3, where it says, in view of foregoing considerations, it would be advisable to make every effort to prevent discrimination against Philippine Army soldiers who are ordered into service of the Armed Forces of the United States. Because what we do know is that we did not see any of these facts or any of these arguments brought forth to Congress to say, we don't know what Romulus said to Osmeña, we don't know if any of this went to any of the US congressmen, and we don't know if it moved them to say whatever. What we do know that discrimination did occur 70 years ago, 70 years ago, and that's where we find ourselves.
Can I just comment on what you said? In those records, you will find a conversation from the White House to Bradley about how to soften these things so it doesn't look like discriminatory.
Oh.
And they talked about how to structure it. So
The White House talked to Bradley?
yeah, White House, and because the White House was concerned that it was discriminatory.
No, this conversation and also the estimate given by General Bradley of $3 billion, did this happen before the first Rescission Act?
Yes, it was the impetus for the first Rescission Act because Senator Hayden was the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, and in that capacity, he wrote to General Bradley as the head of the Veterans Administration to provide him with information about how much would it cost to fund the Filipino soldiers in the U.S. Armed Forces. And General Bradley wrote him back and said it will cost $3 billion. That information was then used, and they said, look, we got to save $3 billion just by
So they passed Rescission 1.
throw the Filipino veterans under the bus, and we'll save $3 billion.
They vetoed the first one, and then they passed the one in February, and this letter comes 6 days before.
Correct.
that-
So we don't know if Romulo received it before I'd like to find the response of Romulo, because if it was sent, it wasn't sent
never
by
got it.
email, or
What
it
was done?
Yeah, what was done. I
What
mean,
was done?
why didn't the Philippine government ask General MacArthur, you're very popular here, you can talk
Well,
to
here's
his
another
senators."
possibility too. The letter was written after it was decided to make Osmeña look good.
No, because it was never,
Well,
it
but it's
wasn't.
in the Philippine government.
No, it's in the archives, but nobody knew about it until I
Well, I'm
actually.
sure
So
someone
that
knows
could-
about it. The
that's
person
the
who
kind.
plays it there.
Well, that's within the realm of possibility.
Yeah.
I think it's a remote because it
Well-
wasn't done for purposes. I mean, this one was very
Well,
specific.
it could have been done to make the Philippines look good after the fact. Because here's what happened. We do know that the second time it came around, that 200 million was going to be paid to the Philippine Army, and it was conditional on the veterans not getting anything.
Well, while
Which is-
let me
which is
just
the
say
caveat
this.
that they,
Let me point this out. Okay.
Wait,
No,
let's-
in
let's talk
response to what he
about-
said. Yes, I'm
Yeah,
going
I
to
know.
talk. Okay, because this is what happened, right? He sent this on February 12. That was passed on February 18. It's interesting that as resident commissioner, it's almost like being a member of Congress. Like if you were representing American Samoa or Guam, you can speak in front of the U.S. Congress. You can't vote. So Romulo, as the High Commissioner of the Philippines, could sit in Congress and could speak. February 18 was when it passed the Congress. When did Romulo speak on the floor of the House to denounce the bill? And this is what I write here, because he gave his speech on May 22, 1946, more than 3 months later. And he said on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives that the Rescission Act was an act of discrimination against Filipinos. The 200 million which were purportedly in lieu of benefits of which Filipino veterans were thus deprived are actually not sufficient to cover the back pay entitled by these veterans. The Philippine government has chosen not to accept this appropriation.
And that is
So,
the question.
the 200, let me finish, then you can go into it after I tell what happened. Okay, so the 200 million was rejected. It's almost like Filipinos, if you owe me $300 and I'm pressing you for the $300 and you say, I'm just giving you $20 and that's it. Filipinos will say, you can keep that, stick it up your whatever, right? That was how Romulo responded. Now, because I anticipate what Rudy is going to say, General Delfin Lorenzana, who is the Veterans Affairs Liaison of the Philippine Embassy in Washington, D.C., in April of 2008 testified in the Senate because Senator Larry Craig, when there was a bill that required unanimous consent of the Senate in order to pass it for the Filipino veterans, he came out in opposition. He said Filipinos are not U.S. citizens, they don't deserve this, so he came out against it. And Lorenzana gave the whole history of the bill. And he said the Philippine records of the Philippine government showed that the $200 million allocated to the Philippines by the Rescission Act of 1946 was never given to the Philippine Army after General Romulo rejected it.
So the money was never sent to the Philippines?
Yes, except that Rudy has
Okay.
kuro from some
Well,
who say-
no, wait.
clarify what you're
When you
saying.
say kuro, okay? When you say kuro, these are information that was relayed to me by the Filipino veterans themselves who were there. Now, some of the information that the veterans gave me, like the two senators that you quoted about Russell, that came from those Filipino Wawa.
No, that came, I'll show you where it came because I found it independently on the internet.
I know,
It was not
but I
kuro-kuro.
brought up to your attention that there has to be an impetus for the Congress to approve the Rescission Act. And that's the reason why they
Right,
did.
but
But
there
wait a
is-
minute.
In other words, it's
There-
not
there-
kuro.
Okay, the former husband of Magdalena Leones, who brought her to my attention as the only Silver Star winner awardee of the World War II, the only women awardee, also gave me the information that there was $200 million that was given to the Philippines. He even gave me the name of the general who Rojas appointed to administer the funds. And the name of the general's there. So at some point, we might be able to discover that that this might very well be true, that there is $200 million, because...
And until we discover that, it's speculation, because I deal with how can it be verified? And I cannot say, well, according to Rudy Asunción,
no,
who
it's
spoke
not Rudy.
to so-and-so,
That
who
is-
said this and this.
That is not the issue.
The issue is there's
information-
nothing-
No, the information came from the World War II veterans. It didn't
One
come from
veteran came and told you, under the law, that's hearsay.
Well,
Well, all these things are...
It's not hearsay if there is a source.
but did money exchange
So where did the
between United
$200
States
million
and the
go?
Philippines?
Well, the question is if
they
it was
appropriate-
rejected, if I give you 200 million
I mean,
and you
but
reject it,
there
then
was-
it stayed with the US
Well,
government.
did Romulo's statements, was it a formal rejection?
Yes,
And-
because he represented the Philippine government. He was the resident high commissioner. He spoke on the floor of the House of Representatives.
So
Unless you're the Pope
Yeah.
or the President of Israel, you don't have that right.
If
Rudy, can I say
if-
something?
Yes.
Rodel is presenting, a lot of information here. Now, I heard from you something that concerns me. Like in 1998, this was not acted upon by, the
By the
US
Congress,
government.
it failed by 11 votes.
Because you said, and the word that you used is that it was not promised. It was not promised. A promise is not needed for this kind of obligation. When in 1941, it was said, it was stated that the army, the Philippine army, will be part of the U.S. Army and fight, for the U.S. government. They were entitled to that. It does not need to be promised anymore.
It was promised, but it was in writing. And when I promise in writing, that becomes a legal obligation.
Yeah, but then it's not even needed. I mean, the argument that was used to deny the payment is not even
No,
valid.
they were
in my
trying-
opinion. Because how it's like this. You marry and then you begat a child. You do not have to say that I promise you, child, that I'm going to feed you every day. You are going to feed the child because that is your obligation. That is your obligation. And that is what is
Let me just explain a little about the law. Okay.
Well, wait.
One
Before we
is-
go there, I'm just citing the rationale and the reason why
It was denied.
it failed by 11
Failed.
votes because of the fact, and he brought a whole slew. If you go into the 1998 hearing of the thing, you might even find that where the $200 million went to.
Anyway.
If you go through the hearing, because they brought everybody in from the VA, from the general from the Philippines to
200 million, according to really,
Yeah,
never
they're-
changed
the
hands.
whole-
If
the whole-
it stayed in the treasury.
the whole documentation was there.
Well-
and then when
Can we
we
access those documents?
Let's bring documents because it's hard to say, well, so and so told me, and I'm sure he's
no,
reliable.
Rodel is there. I mean, the
Well,
whole proceeding was recorded.
Then present it. That's what the reason why you're doing all of this and having the record is so we can have something in writing.
Do they have documentation? Because you said,
Yeah,
who was it that represented the Philippine government?
Lorenzana. Yeah,
So-
we know General
I
Lorenzana.
know him.
Yeah.
So he must have some
He
kind
has,
of-
because he
of
cannot
product.
just say that
Yeah.
and not fear being contradicted. Nobody has contradicted him.
But the idea of
When he
the
said-
200 million though is that it was going to support the Philippine Army. Did the Philippine Army use it and then was it
Well, they,
somehow?
as far as we know, they never received
never-
it, except that General
There was-
Asunción.
Because that was.
Wait, Rodel,
Rudy
I really
Asunción.
said that.
No, I was
Hey,
talking about the
listen,
general you
You've been
said.
speaking for the 35 minutes.
Sorry.
When there was something interjecting,
No,
you say,
listen.
no, wait a minute.
General
That's not fair,
Lorenzana.
Rodel.
Can we contact General Lorenzana? I believe he retired in DC.
Call Eric. Eric is
Yeah,
regular.
right.
You know,
But he's still in
And
Washington.
The,
Yeah, I
the
don't know.
important, the
He
important
might-
thing about this conversation here about the Rescission Act is that there's a lot that isn't known about something that happened 70 years ago, and yet is impacting people today. And one of the things, if we're all news guys, news is interesting, history is boring, unless there's history that's unlearned and history that's unknown, and then it's tragic, because then we're bound to relive this kind of episode. Because the only thing we can really say 70 years later is that the discrimination took place, the racism was real. The racism that passed the Rescission Act 1 and 2, February 18th, 70 years ago, has seeds of antipathy toward Filipinos that we saw turn of the century, that we saw in the 20s, that we saw in the 30s, that we saw with Tidings McDuffie, that we saw, 1946. I mean, it's clear that what we're dealing with is not Filipinos as equal partners. We're not dealing with Filipinos as respected, as a respected nation, as respected peoples. We're dealing with Filipinos as pawns. Filipinos as they might as well be drones, right? These soldiers who went out there, who were fodder. I think what's important, because I was shocked about the 200 million myself. I've been writing about this for a long time too, but I stop at the headline. I stop at the Rescission Act, the promise made, the promise broken, and then we talk about the people who are real, the monos. We talk about the guys who fought. And I think one thing that I find interesting is that when I talk to Filipino Americans like myself, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the sides are, who's on what side. A lot of people think that, my dad was a vet. Well, yeah, my dad came in 1929, but he was old, so he was too old for the Army in World War II. But if he came and he was 16 in 1929, by the time World War II, he was young enough to be in the Army. And the guys here in America are different from the guys in the Philippines. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. They don't understand the difference between the old scouts and the new scouts. They don't understand the difference between the Philippine Army. They don't understand the difference between the guerrillas. My goodness, I talked to some guerrillas, and I didn't even understand what their role was. Ernie Mabala was a guerrilla in Stockton, and when I talked to him, I didn't understand what it meant to be going out in the jungle with a slingshot, and yet that's what they did. And that's because when you talk to most of the guerrillas, they'll say, I'm not a military man. They'll say that. They say, I just went out to do the intel for my country because I answered the call. And I think what would be productive, I think it's tremendous that you found that document, Riddell, because the details there are so telling about what the Filipinos expected, what they wanted, but they weren't heard. What's more telling is that you talk to people today and they just don't understand
And that's
what this is going on. Where the battle lines are drawn. So I have a cousin, who their father came to from the Philippines in 1930, before the Tidings McDuffie, right? 1933. He went into the Army from Stockton, was here in San Francisco, was a barber, proud veteran, GI Bill, that's how the Filipino Americans in World War II were able to build up.
What you say, Rodel, is that the government of the United States never gave the Philippines a single dollar?
According to General Lorenzana, and you can
And that's something that I cannot
But let's put it
understand.
this way. When he said that, he said it officially on the floor. There are investigators, there are all of these. If he said something that was not true, from 1998 to the present, someone would have come forward and said, General Lorenzana, you're lying.
Either that or somebody didn't care or not paying attention.
But
because
what I'm saying,
according to the testimony of the Veterans Affairs and the Army and the Congress...
Show it to me.
No, according to the testimony, there were funds that was given to the Philippines.
Yes, but not the 200 million.
600 million.
Yes, but
200
not
million.
the 200 million that was in the Rescission
They
Act.
might have got
That's
I have a
different.
question to the 200 million. Okay, granted that we've never received the 200 million, but it was part of the Rescission Act, so it was the law.
Right.
It was appropriated.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Someone
it is
got it.
appropriated.
Or
So
business.
basically, it should still be in the books, right?
Yes.
And
Call up General Lorenzana.
Well, no, the Lorenzana
we
is not
should-
the one.
No, but he said it, so
I know,
he
but-
was representing, and he said the records of the Philippines showed it was never received,
So we should pursue getting that money.
plus interest.
Plus interest, yeah.
Yes.
And legal costs.
Right.
And
So
some legal
this is
costs.
a
I
cold
hope
case.
you're right, and I
It's a
hope
cold
you're wrong.
case. Well,
Because if you're right, then
you would
get
think
nothing.
that someone would notice $200 million some years ago
Yeah, it
missing,
was
but
appropriated,
Yeah.
it never went anywhere. It was not
So
given.
I got a
That's our
question.
assignment,
So, our key
you
to
know,
this,
our $200 million
So now-
assignment.
so what
How-
we want
how
to do
can
is
we
collect
resolve
facts.
Huh?
How can we,
Well,
70 years later?
Perry
how
is
can
going
we-
to call General
Okay, so
Lorenzana.
he
Well,
talks,
yeah, but I'm not
he
really
talks to the
General
general.
Lorenzana, Facebook
He was-
friend. So I'm gonna send him a
Yeah, just send it, okay.
There
But
should
let me
be
just say,
congressional records,
let
though.
me
$200
bring
million
another
is-
issue about that you brought up. My article came out in the Inquirer.net this morning. There was one comment at the end, someone who read it and responded, and he referenced Mitt Romney's statement in 2012 about moochers, the 47% of the American people who are moochers. And he said that the Filipino veterans are moochers. They're always asking for handouts from the government. And I responded and said, were the U.S. soldiers who fought during the war, when they came back and they received the benefits of the GI Bill and they went to school, were they moochers? When they received the loans from the U.S. government
Did he
in order to buy a house?
specifically, did Ronnie
Yeah.
specifically say that?
No, he was talking, remember the famous
Right, the
line that was
47%,
recorded,
yeah.
47%?
Emil,
But
It's just
anyway,
like
the article
Tom
was
Brokaw
saying-
never recognized the Filipinos as part of the.
Yeah,
the-
but what I
yeah.
just want to say is that the idea of Filipinos as moochers, as this one was saying, is a product of what has happened because of the fact that the Rescission Act happened. In other words, if that had not passed, you said that it's just an obligation to a child. No, there is a difference between a moral obligation and a legal duty. When President Roosevelt signed that law, that executive order in 1941, it became a legal obligation, not a moral one. So only the Rescission Act erased it. So when Rudy was talking about Stump saying there's no promise, it's because that was rescinded. If it had not been rescinded, that promise that is in writing would still be.
And that begs
In
the
effect.
question, that executive order of President Roosevelt, was it ever rescinded by any
No.
president?
Well,
so it's still...
It was rescinded by the Rescission Act.
Oh, by the
in
Rescission Act.
1946.
The Indian Giver
Not by
Act.
any presidential
Okay,
order.
so it's...
Yes.
But it was signed by Truman with the understanding that he signed it under with a certain amount of reluctance, because in public papers that came out after he signed it, he did, and I'm pretty sure this was maybe a matter of trying to have some kind of public statement to mitigate the blow and the
But-
discrimination. But still, it indicates that there was some kind of struggle with this. And if
You know what
we
we call that in the Philippines?
What's that?
Consolación de bobo.
okay, so
That's what it is.
yeah.
When I said that it did not need to be promised, I was referring to the legal obligation that Roosevelt created in 1941.
Yeah.
In 1941. Now, the promise to, and I think what you are referring to as a promise is the 200,000 that was promised
200 million.
in the Rescission Act. In the Rescission Act. Now, yeah, because I don't see where a promise was made. If it was and Osmeña made a computation. He made a computation $1.275 billion. That is an obligation, a legal obligation, as you said, that was created by Roosevelt in signing that law in 1941. Now, if there was a rescission that was not completed, then
No, it was.
But let me just say that Rudy and Perry are onto something, because if Congress passed the law in 1946 granting 200 million, Romulo cannot on the House floor by himself saying,
We're
you
not
can
taking
keep it, that's not, it needs,
binding.
yeah,
The
it
money went
needs an
somewhere.
act of
The
Congress
the
to say, okay, if you're not accepting it, we're taking it back.
So,
You know,
if
so
then
therefore-
Congress must have passed a law
Right.
saying we're taking back the
So
200
that's
million,
our-
and there's no such thing,
That's
right?
our mission, find
Yeah.
out what
Find out,
happened to
yeah.
the 200
$200
million.
million. Well,
But
it's,
that's,
you
that's
can't,
basically the basis, that's basically the basis of the quit claim that they attach with the 200 million, and that's the reason
What
why.
quit claim?
That they will not, that the services of the veterans would not be, a service in the service.
When
of
did
the
they sign the
military.
quit claim?
Huh?
No, no,
No,
it's not a
no,
quit
as a
claim, it's
condition, as a condition of accepting the 200
No,
million.
that's not.
there,
Wait,
there was a condition,
Wait.
by Truman signed.
As a condition.
No, there's two
Rodel,
different issues.
I
As
know.
a lawyer, let me explain.
Wait, Rodel, let me just say this. As a condition for accepting the $200 million, you agree that the service of the Filipino World War II veterans, it will be deemed as not service
No.
performance.
Let me explain why that's not true, okay?
What-
In 1946, the Philippine Commonwealth Army was under the United States government. So there was no party to deal with. You cannot, in other words, if you're under the U.S. and you say yes sir to the U.S.,
No, we're only talking about the $200 million if you accept this.
there is nothing in the law that says
Well,
it is conditional
but that's one of-
on your
I know,
accepting
but
it.
that's, Rodel, you're refusing the fact that there was such a thing.
Yeah,
No,
there
there
was
wasn't.
a rider, there was a rider attached that said the 200 million would be paid, and the rider said that in exchange for the 200 million.
No, I read that, it's not, no, that's not true.
Okay,
You know, it's not
okay,
true
wait,
to say that there's a-
Rodel, that is
It
one
was-
thing, that is another thing that we're gonna need to look into.
Well, let me
and-
just
and resolve.
clarify.
And that's the reason why we're having this
I
conversation.
know, but what I'm just saying is that the Rescission Act clarified that service in the U.S. In the Commonwealth Army is not service in the United States Armed Forces.
Right.
There is nothing in that bill or law that says if you agree, then you will get the 200 million.
Well,
No, it's
That
not
is
that at
not-
all.
that's it.
All it says is that when you accept the 200 million, you will accept that
That is not
They
true.
expect a final payment.
That is not
Well,
true.
look,
That
this is a legal
No,
claim.
wait,
That
wait,
is
wait.
not true.
But this is the thing
Well-
that constitutional lawyers will debate whether or not you can, if the Philippines is a territory, right, is underneath the U.S. Army, or whether or not the Constitution applies. These are the side issues that have not really been addressed or have not been.
And that's the reason why we're having this
Read
conversation.
it, because there's nothing that says
Well,
as a
Rodel-
condition to accepting, it was never, the Philippine, if you work for me as my servant, if I'm your master, you're my slave, if I'm your colonizer, you're my colonized, we're not on equal footing that I can give you a condition in which you are free to accept or reject.
Well,
You don't have that right.
the idea about Rescission Act 1 or A and B on February 18th was the 200 million to the Philippine Army was brought to Truman, and Truman regretted signing it, but he did, and there was a rider attached to it that said that made the service ineligible.
No, yeah, it's
Right.
not the rider to the, we're talking,
Well, the impact is the same. The impact is
it
that
was,
the vets.
you're
the vets-
making it appear like it was a condition precedent to the acceptance and it wasn't like that. They were not on equal footing. This was the U.S. government that was on top of the Commonwealth Army.
Right.
And you're saying, okay, this is what we're allocating because funds to the Philippine Commonwealth Army come from the U.S. Congress. So we are giving you this 200 million, and we're also clarifying, not as a condition, we're just clarifying, making it a statement that service in the Commonwealth Army.
What you're saying may be true, but the effect is that Truman signed it, and it was put on him politically that here is a condition that you will accept.
No, he did not make that a condition. It's not, a president
No,
doesn't
it's a
have the
condi-
power
No,
to
it's
add
not. It's a condition.
to something.
No,
You know, you don't do that.
It's a condition for accepting the 200 million.
No, there
But
was
he's
no
saying-
such thing. You're making that up. That's not anywhere in that.
Rodel, wait a minute.
Can we?
You don't know that for sure.
I know that because I read it, unless you can point
I know,
to me.
but there are, like I said, there are things yet that we have not learned
Well,
yet.
until we learn.
Until today, you did not never know about that letter that Rojas. or that
I
letter
understand, and
said
now
no.
that I read it, I can talk about it. I cannot talk about
$200
speculation.
million in that letter?
No, what they
We're talking about the 200 million.
But you are basing it on your supposition, based on what somebody told you.
You have two people here.
Just based on the recorded history and the effect of that was that Truman signed it, he regretted the fact that he had to sign it, but the impact was the same. The Philippines was said to have, the Philippine Army was said to have been given 200 million,
But we don't know where.
and then
Let me explain one more thing, you know. In his expression of regret about signing it, it was very interesting because we have here the words that he said. And one of the things that's interesting here is because there were two aspects of the Rescission Act that were done on the same day that he signed into law. The other one had to do with the second, scouts. But the other aspect that, if you read the letter of Osmeña to Romulo, one of the things he was saying was the discrepancy in the pay of the Philippine Constabulary and the Philippine Army. One was going to be on a one-on-one basis, the other was on a one-to-two basis. And he said that that's discriminatory. Why are you going to distinguish between the Philippine Constabulary, the Philippine Commonwealth and the Philippine Army in terms of paying them two different things? In Truman's expression, read his words, he was saying there's something wrong about this and this should be corrected. So he was not talking about the fact that they would be, it's a different level to say he was regretting the fact that Filipinos would not be considered members of the U.S. Army for benefits, military benefits, and he was talking about the discrimination against the Commonwealth and the Army, and he was saying that something should be done to correct that. So the fact that he expressed regret doesn't mean he was regretting the entire thing, but only the particulars of that.
it was a political statement that he made to make it look like he did have some feelings for the heroic Filipino soldiers, but the ultimate impact is the veterans were denied and have been fighting to have these claims and these benefits restored. And we can argue about whether what exactly they meant, but we know what happened. 70 years later, we know what happened.
That's all just for show.
Well, it's a public document that no one really talks about, just like when Romulo talked in May after the Rescission Act was signed and done with, what value was Romulo's rhetoric? It didn't have any impact.
Yeah.
No one chimed in and said, okay, we're going to reverse that darn paper because it was unfair to those Filipinos. No. So, look, this is an interesting academic exercise and we should dig up more because maybe there is a missing 200 million. But I would dare say that it probably was lost in 2008 when he had the crash. It probably was lost in the first Iraq War. It probably was lost, and all the really important point is
What I will
Filipinos
do,
have always been.
What I will do is
on the
I'll
short end.
forward to each one of you the entire testimonial and the proceeding of the 1998 hearing in Congress, because there you will find out whether the $200 million was given to the Philippines or not, whether there was testimony, whether it was given, et cetera. Because everything's there.
Well,
Yeah, but
here's
you
the
should
other-
have brought a copy of it and read from it
It's
for this
it's
purpose.
192
No, but
pages.
the section that talks about the 200 million is probably only one
All right,
part.
but
Where do you find that document?
He will send it to you, but
Yeah, I'll send it to
you have to call all over just
No,
to
just
find.
the portion.
I know, that's the one that you should have
Well,
made
no,
a copy.
because if you read the entire testimony, you will find in the proper context why we failed by 11 votes.
No, but we need the facts.
All right,
Well, I know,
look, I don't think we're ever gonna find the 200 million. But
Yeah.
what's interesting is the dynamic between the Filipinos who are in power and the Filipinos who aren't in power. And, you know, and we'll bring James in on this because he knows about the Tithing McDuffie Act. And we know that a lot of it was contingent on, at some point, the Philippines is gonna be independent. At some point, the Philippines is gonna be on its own. And so we're gonna limit immigration, we're gonna let the Filipinos do their thing, because we know that there were people who wanted the Filipinos here in the US
No, and one
to
of
be
the
strong,
reasons-
but there was also people who just who wanted, right? They were looking at what's going on. The Filipino nationalists
Inside.
were interested in what was going on, and they had different views with, you know, the fate of the Filipinos here in America. And I think we're dealing with something like that when we talk about what happened to that 200 million.
Oh, I don't have it.
And as always, we're dealing with Philippine elites versus
It's okay.
Philippine non-elites.
Excuse me.
Because I just can't believe that that the U.S. government did not give a single dollar to help the Philippines. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this because there's a lot of opposition to the Filipino Veterans Equity Act, as you know. The American Legion publicly would say, yes, we support the Filipino Wabat veterans, they ought to get that. But that's it. They didn't lobby, they didn't do anything, and if you talk to them in private, they really are not in favor of, because the American military always felt that the Filipinos were fortunate that the Americans took them into their military, because if not, they would have been decimated by the Japanese without the help of the Americans, number one. Number two, most of the military that I talk with, veterans, U.S. military that are here in this building, and this comes from corporal to admiral to general, admiral even commanded the 7th Fleet. They said, hey, the Filipinos were defending against the Japanese for their country. That's basically what the American military was, their mental.
So what you're saying is that
They
the
did not
Filipinos
support.
fought not to defend Uncle Sam, but to defend
Yeah,
the Philippines.
yeah. That's basically
So why
what.
pay them?
Huh?
So they don't need to be paid.
Well, no, that's not what they're saying. They don't need to be paid. All they're saying is that they are not really entitled to pensions and all these things that we were asking, because they really fought for their country.
Well,
And they should be thankful to the America for taking them in, because without the military guidance of without the American military.
see, USAFE has never been part of the U.S. military community. It's actually separate from, if you're a USAFE veteran, which most of those World War II Filipino veterans are, they were not part of the mainstream American military establishment.
Yeah, but they were not part of that Philippine army. See, USAFE is American military. They got their benefits. Everybody who's in the USAFE got their benefits. The old scout, they got their benefits. The only one that really didn't get the benefits primarily are those Commonwealth Army
Guerrillas.
and guerrillas. That,
Well, you had to be registered or official on an official list, and there's a lot of dispute on a lot of politics between who was leading, which commander was leading which set of rebels. So that's probably explains why you have a lot of the records disputes. Who's on the official list and who isn't. But I don't think we're ever going to get to what happened to that money. And I think in general, what we can get at is that Filipinos were treated poorly then, they continue to be treated poorly, and it just happens to be our natural condition. And I think that there were people who were who may have been in control, who got that 200 million in the Philippines. We may not know about it, but you know, it wouldn't surprise me if it got into the Philippine government or some, you know, to some
one of the-
elites there, and you
one
know,
of the
there'd be no way
rationale-
to trace it.
You know, because Rodel and I, for a couple of weeks, talked back and forth because we were trying to find out who sponsored this Rescission Act. Was this the bill that is sponsored by a congressman, by a senate? And the only ones that we found was Russell and Hayden, who basically brought up the premise that it's better for us to give the Filipino veterans a way to make a living by fixing the infrastructure of the Philippines and paying them instead of relying on the U.S. government for their monthly. And that's basically the rationale that they use so that they can pass the
Why
Rescission
can't
Act.
we ask our congressperson, you know, can you find out what happened to the $200 million allocated in the Rescission Act of 1946? They can be able to find out because that was an allocation by Congress. So they can find out, well, it was given on such and such a day.
If a
Oh,
check
it
was
was
issued.
rejected, huh?
If a check was issued.
Yeah, I mean, was it,
Yeah.
we should find out because that's a matter of historical record and a member of Congress can be able to find that out. You know, it doesn't have to be a mystery that we'll never know. We can
Yes,
know.
go ahead.
When you said,
If it was appropriated,
promised,
We will know.
What?
Yeah.
You know,
If it wasn't,
If it
then
wasn't,
we will know that
it's in
too.
the treasury.
If it's worth pursuing.
Then we can sue.
No,
That was making
no.
us
We
ask.
did.
When I said, hold on for a second, I think we're still recording. His question was, what was promised?
When you said promise, it was not promised. What were you referring to? Is it the 200 million?
No,
Or is it
no.
1.273 billion?
No, what I was referring to that was promised, that was not promised, was the benefits
For service.
So,
for service.
It
There
was
was no,
promised in
okay.
1941.
and
It was
Osmeña quantified that.
rescinded.
And Osmeña
The
quantified that.
promise was rescinded.
And
I know,
Osmeña
but there
quantified that.
was no, during the 1998 hearing in Congress, they debated that, they looked for anybody that made any promise from MacArthur to the president to any general, and there was nothing on writing that said,
Was-
if you join the military, you will get benefits.
It's in the executive order. Senator Inouye referred to it in his speech sponsoring it. It was
I
never
know.
disputed. Why would they pass a Rescission Act in 1946
That's
if there
right.
was nothing to rescind?
That's right. There's nothing to rescind.
Because they were about ready to roll out the GI Bill of Rights.
Look at it. There's reference in this thing as to when the GI Bill of Rights was done, and it was in 19. Look at the GI Bill.
According to testimony in Congress,
Well, they can
I
give
think
you
now,
whatever
what
it
you're
is.
referring to.
It's here. The
Not
GI
promised.
Bill of Rights, Public Law 346, 78 Congress. Now, this was
What year was
already,
that?
this was 1944, the Servicemen Readjustment Act of 1944.
I know, but you know they had to be ratified too and everything. The Senate had-
1946, this was already talking about the benefits. This was written in 1946 about the law in 1944. So you're not talking about 19. Cite the actual, bring something. So rather than say,
Well, I know.
someone told me, well, I think I remember so and
Yeah,
so.
oo. Tama. Tama, pare. Oo.
Well, what?
Be very factual. Kasi-
Well, I know, but what I'm saying is that Rodel came prepared because he printed all these things that he found out from the
It's my fault.
conversation.
I'm sorry, it's my
from the
fault.
conversation.
You are part of
I started this conversation 2
You
weeks
are part of
ago.
organizing this. Di sana, you could have brought documents.
Well,
that
but look,
will
this
support
is
your,
not an evidentiary hearing. This is just a conversation,
It's just a
right?
conversation between.
It should hopefully, when we're talking about
I know, but,
historical events, is that we talk about facts.
Well, yes, true, but sometimes based on the history, based on news accounts, we'll get things secondhand. This is a document that hasn't been viewed or discussed, and its presence is interesting, but really, in terms of its relevancy, it's not really that relevant to.
It's more relevant to talk about something somebody said to someone
all right.
that we don't have. That's more
All
relevant.
right. Well, this is more relevant. It's something concrete.
You're
But,
basically,
you know, we're, in terms of the Rescission Act,
Rodell is making like everything's known already, and everything is
No,
what is
but
presented.
we should start
No,
with
it's
what we know rather than what we don't know and speculate
Yeah,
about
and
what we don't
presume-
know.
Presume something against us.
well, look, in terms of the conversation about where we are now 70 years later, no one has bothered to look for this 200 million until we have decided we're going to make it our cause.
Well, no,
today.
because this idea came up because Rodell said that it was never given to the Philippines.
Well,
When
I think
all
it's
along,
I said-
when all along,
I
everybody
It's worth
assumed.
looking at.
No, no, wait a minute.
I was
That's
surprised.
also
that-
hearsay from the Luciana. But all along, everybody is in the same mindset that $200 million was given to the Philippines. Until Rodell said today that no, it was never given. So that's the thing that we need to research.
Well,
whether
that's
it was
true. I was
given.
under the impression that it was, right? I mean, look, if it's appropriated
It has
and we
to be
went through the
somewhere.
Rescission Act,
Well,
we
that's-
have, the assumption is it was
well,
paid.
we can find that out.
Yeah, we will,
Should we find out by
find
just
that out.
calling our congressman saying, you know, can you find out if the 200 million allocated in the Rescission Act of 1946 was ever given to the Philippines?
Yeah.
If so, when? And who was it given to and what
Yes.
happened to the 200 million? That's all we need to do. And, you know, I'm just surprised nobody has ever done it.
Yeah, because
Well,
this
the
is
assumption
first time
was
that you
that it
come
was
out
paid.
and said that it was never given to the Philippines. All along, everybody's accepted the fact that there was $200 million that was given to the Philippines to transition the military personnel
Look,
into
and look,
civilian life.
if you think about it logically, the United States still, you know, was interested in the fledgling democracy of the Philippines. They were interested in the Philippines as a strategic place.
Yeah.
You know, it would not, and that they understood that the 200 million represented a savings. Then, you know, this is not something you'd say, oh, let's hide this 200 million from the Philippines. So
Let's look at another fact, okay? Do you know the Bell Trade Act? Do you know the Philippine Parity Amendment? Do you know the Philippine Trade Act? I mention all of that
That is one
because
of the reasons why this thing
in,
is.
when the U.S. was talking about giving money to the Philippines under the Philippine Trade Act, the U.S. asked the Republic of the Philippines, not the Commonwealth government, but the government of Rojas, to first amend the Philippine Constitution and to include the parity amendment so that American firms would have the same rights as Philippine firms in the exploitation of the natural resources
All
of the
right,
country.
look, I don't know about these specific acts or these specific
Me neither.
instances. However, but it does show that there's reason to be skeptical of all of these types of transactions between the U.S. and the Philippines. However, we've all.
The difference I'm saying is that those acts happened when the Philippines was an independent
Right.
country. So, and the difference is that this happened when the Philippines
The
was
territory.
a vassal state,
Right.
was a colony, was a commonwealth.
Territory.
So we are not on equal footing.
Well,
We were not on equal footing even then, but I'm just saying at least
Right.
as government to
Well,
government.
so it means that the United States may have seen it as, well, this is our territory, maybe we can give it, maybe we can't, maybe we'll give it over a period of time, maybe, you know.
Instead of speculating, all we have to do is assign ourselves that we're all
No, we
going to
will,
right.
we will go ahead and research that out.
Yeah.
Because,
we should.
because if that $200 million wasn't definitely mentioned during the, I would be very, very surprised.
Because if we find out it's still sitting there somewhere, we've got a class action lawsuit going.
There you go.
So I'll take a stab at this since I've been quiet all evening.
Go ahead.
You know, first of all, what's amazing to me is the parallels that occurred. My specialty is the period of the 1930s, and I read congressional records, thousands and thousands of pages. So I have to agree with Rodell here. There are records of this. This is not a complicated issue. I think the logic is fairly clear. Let me talk about my work, and then we can apply it here. When the Philippines became a colony, became a territory of the United States, under international law, the Philippines automatically should have been a territory of the Philippines and
Of
here's
the
the of the U.S. And here's the problem: the Filipinos should have been American citizens. America definitely did not want that to be the case. The AFL-CIO was very opposed to it. So the rescinding act was the 1901 Gonzales versus Williams. The Gonzales versus Williams stipulated that Filipinos will become nationals. They will not become citizens. That never existed before. And the Americans came up with that term to ensure that Filipinos will not become US citizens. Countries have never seen that word before. Subjects, nationals, and citizens are always the same. And the United States said, no, we're going to make a separation. So it's very, very interesting that the veterans, from my opinion, and the veterans case is much stronger when Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed an executive order. That's clear, right? When he says that the Philippine forces in the Philippines will become part of the United States Army, it's crystal clear that they will also get the benefits that are allotted to whomever is a member of the Army. Now, what's very interesting is just because you're American, it doesn't mean they're going to give you your benefits. MacArthur's father, for example, put down a rebellion by World War I veterans who wanted their benefits. And
It was MacArthur.
MacArthur himself,
Really?
as a young man, not his father.
Not his father.
So I stand corrected.
Yeah.
But remember, even Americans were not allocated their benefits. And if you look at the Iraqi war today, even our Iraqi war veterans are not exactly given their full benefits. So the parallels are very, very amazing. So the Rescinding Act was done so that we don't have to give them their benefits. Now, what's interesting for me is the Osminia argument. You know, Osminia passed the first independence bill, the
Hair horse.
hair horse cutting bill was passed, and the president of the United States signed it, and it was sent to the Philippine legislature, and Quezon turned it down. His argument was, I can make a better bill. And of course, he did not. He passed practically an identical bill. So it's amazing for me that Osminia got kind of gypped twice.
Twice.
But
yes.
Osminia is a very interesting person. He's from Cebu. He is Chinese Filipino. He's not as good looking as Quezon. And you know, he did not have the personality of Quezon. So for me, the key here is Senator Hayden and Russell, Southern Democrats.
Yeah.
Very, very racially patriarchal,
Segregation.
to put the polite term. So just like the AFL-CIO was lobbying, do not make Filipinos United States citizens, I am quite certain that the South will also lobby, do not give these Filipino people
Correct.
their benefits. To me, the logic is very clear. Now, regarding the 200 million, that's not difficult. There is an accounting, you know, what is it called? The GAO. They do an accounting. By the way, losing $200 million is not a surprise. We lose hundreds of billions of dollars
Especially in the
today.
Well,
So,
200 million back
200
then would have been a little more significant than today.
It would probably be
Because-
$200 billion.
Right, I mean, the fact that they gave 300 million.
If we lose that today, we are losing that today.
Yeah.
And it's,
But
you know,
speaking of historical parallels, Rudy and I saw a movie called Lincoln, where Lincoln signed an executive order emancipating the slaves. And there was a discussion in the movie when we saw it that Lincoln said he has to get the constitutional amendment passed, I think the 13th amendment. Otherwise, any succeeding president can just rescind the Emancipation Proclamation and it would no effect. So that's why, I mean, it had a legal effect during the war. And that was also the interesting thing. Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation to change the tide of the war. By emancipating the blacks, they became part of the Union Army, and that changed the war. Towards the beginning of the war, when the prospect of a war with Japan was happening, getting the Philippines to sign up and become part of the U.S. Armed Forces was also strategic for the U.S. war. So there is, you know, when we look at parallels, there's also that historical parallel to the Civil War.
Yeah.
well, let me finish my last point here. The last point that I'm going to make is, as the United States Resident Commissioner, by the way, we still have that today, the representative from Guam and Puerto Rico and American Samoa and the United States Virgin Islands are in fact the equivalent. I don't know if they have voting powers now.
No.
No.
But
No.
then they did not. All they
Even
can
Washington
do-
DC doesn't have.
All they can do is argue passionately. My dissertation argued that even though people like Osminia argued, and Quezon was a funny guy, he would say one thing and then, behind closed doors he would say another thing. The Philippines, by and large, was really helpless against the United States government. The United States government literally dictated the terms of the colonial relationship. So the fact that he wrote this, and we were still officially a commonwealth at this time, is very, very important and interesting. And I think this is an important point to do further research. I'm pretty confident that you do a forensic economist and they can find where that $200 million is, because the United States does an accounting every year, and they can tell you where that appropriated money was taken.
This is just at the beginning of a series of conversations like this, because there are other conversations that we are going to have in these facilities, because one of the main functions of this education center is to provide a research facility so that these things can be aired out. And so I'm going to again call for another conversation, but let me assure everybody that when we have another conversation, we're going to have facts about this $200 million. We're going to have a lot of other things that we discussed over here that they all seem to think that doesn't exist because it's not, we haven't learned it yet, we haven't discovered it yet. But like what we discovered with Russell and what's his name? The rationale that they put together so that the Rescission Act will pass, because the United States is fair. It's a country that's fairer than most. Most countries are not as fair as the United States. So we have to give, due respect to the United States that that it will be fair, that it will treat Filipinos fairly, and in this case, Filipinos were not treated fairly, but.
Well, one of the things that came out just from doing the kind of cursory research that I've done, and just from hearing the conversation that James and Riddell has brought out, there is a fair amount of racism involved here that people don't really want to acknowledge, but we know that that was part of Tidings McDuffie. We know that Filipinos were subject to that in the 20s. We know that, how the immigration laws changed, with 1934. And we know that the rhetoric that was present that brought forth Tidings McDuffie was there in the 40s. So the AFL-CIO being strongly against Filipinos being citizens doesn't surprise me. And the Filipinos not being really having much say at all in the colonial relationship doesn't surprise me either.
But can I interrupt real quick? But it was not just the AFL-CIO, it was
others,
also
right.
the
I don't want to say
nativists that were also opposed to Chinese immigration,
Right.
Japanese immigration,
Yeah.
were also there.
Right, I don't want to just single out the AFL-CIO, but, I do want to point out that a lot of people don't see Tidings McDuffie as the Filipino exclusion. Historians maybe, but you ask people walking around, number one, have you heard of Tidings McDuffie? Do you know what the effect was? Do you know about the Filipinos who were in Angel Island because of that? And, a lot of people don't know. And this is what is the most important thing about the retelling after 70 years and finding new things after 70 years, because people need to know. History is best when it's just history because it's static and you can just poke at it. It's worse when it's news, because then it means that people haven't learned, and then it becomes this tragedy. And that's unfortunately what this is, because there's still Filipino veterans still looking to get their money and still being denied, right? And no one, there doesn't seem to be any political will right now to go forward to fight for the remaining few. There's just a handful now, less than 60 official appeals that are active,
right
but
now.
there are about 1,000 that could, and of course they're dying every day. So maybe they're just waiting for that.
Thank you for watching. I want to see you next week. Good night, magandang gabi. See you next week. Marami pong salamat.